Standing at one corner of the city square in Melbourne is this statue of the explorers Burke and Wills, a monument to the most expensive and tragic of all the expeditions that tried to cross Australia. In the 1850s, Victoria was the wealthiest state in Australia. For during the gold rushes, millions of people had poured in from all over the world. Business boomed, and the money flowed. The city of Melbourne was only about 30 years old, but already it was expanding quickly and attracting many brilliant and cultured people. One of these was the young German botanist Dr. Ferdinand von Mueller. He'd already been exploring with Augustus Gregory in northern Australia, collecting new plants and looking for traces of his fellow German explorer Ludwig Leichhardt, who disappeared somewhere in central Australia in 1848. The black areas on this map show how much of Australia was still unexplored in the late 1850s. The continent had never been crossed from north to south, and this seemed to offer some kind of challenge to many adventurous people. With this idea in mind, a wealthy merchant in Melbourne made a generous donation to the Philosophical Institute, and a public meeting was advertised in the Argus, 1858. Exploration of Australia. A citizen of Melbourne, having signified to Sir William Stawell, President of the Philosophical Institute, his intention of subscribing £1,000 to the purpose of the exploration of Australia, on condition of a certain further sum being subscribed by the public towards the same object. After the meeting, an exploration committee was formed, and the first job was to appoint a leader. 3 names appeared in the final ballot. Major Peter Warburton, a South Australian, got 5 votes, Robert O'Hara Burke, 10 votes, and a Mr. Temsky, none. To the committee, Robert O'Hara Burke seemed the best of all 14 applicants. He was a 37-year-old police inspector from Castlemaine, and had previously been a captain in the Austrian army. He'd never been exploring during his 5 years in Australia, but he seemed to make decisions quickly and easily, and was a natural leader. There was much planning and organizing to be done. Here's part of the list of stores bought for the expedition, enough to keep 20 men going for 12 months. Dried meat, bacon, flour, rice, sugar, tea, tobacco, salt, and oatmeal for the camels and their Afghan drivers. There was also ghee, or clarified butter, soap, vinegar, 1 cheese, and 20 gallons of lime juice. The lime juice, being high in vitamin C, was taken on most expeditions to prevent scurvy. By August 1860, the Victorian Exploring Expedition, as it was officially called, was fully assembled and ready to go. No effort or money had been spared to make this the best-equipped expedition ever to traverse the inland. An official artist and naturalist was appointed to the expedition to record the events for posterity. He was Ludwig Becker, a 52-year-old German-born intellectual who'd travelled widely in Europe before sailing to Australia in 1851. The surveyor was William John Wills, a gifted and quiet Englishman of 26. At the time, he was employed at the Flagstaff Observatory in Melbourne, where he was highly regarded for his careful and methodical work. Finally, Burke was given his instructions from the Exploration Committee. Upon you as leader of the party now organized to explore the interior of Australia. The committee, having decided upon Cooper's Creek of Sturts as the basis of your operations, requests that you will proceed thither, form a depot of provisions and stores, and make arrangements for keeping open a communication in your rear to the Darling. Notice the emphasis on the need to keep lines of communication open. And so, on August the 20th, 1860, people gathered in Royal Park, then on the outskirts of Melbourne, to see them off. 27 camels had been specially imported from India by George Landels, a camel expert who was second in command of the expedition. While in India, he enlisted 3 native camel drivers and a young Englishman who'd been in the Indian Army, John King. King was employed because he could speak the language of the camel drivers. The artist William Strutt drew this picture of the expedition party leaving Melbourne. There's Burke riding his favourite horse, Billy. And just behind Burke, on a camel, is Ludwig Becker, the artist and naturalist. William John Wills, surveyor and astronomer, is leading the pack horses with his instruments and notebooks. And behind them, riding a camel, came John King. And further back, 2 specially constructed carts that could be turned into boats when the wheels were removed. On the way, the expedition often camped near Aborigines, and the artist Ludwig Becker was fascinated by their life and customs. About this time, it became known that the veteran South Australian explorer John McDouall Stewart was getting ready to leave Adelaide on yet another attempt to cross Australia. People started to believe that some kind of race was taking place, and this cartoon appeared in the Melbourne Punch. Burke's expedition crossed many rivers on its way north. They were heading towards Menindee on the Darling, but the pace was getting painfully slow. It had taken them 3 weeks to reach this crossing of the Warcool River in New South Wales, and Burke was starting to get impatient, always afraid that the South Australian would beat him. The next day they rode into Balranald, and Burke took drastic action to speed things up. He dumped more of his stores. He'd already auctioned some of them at Swan Hill a week earlier. They camped the next night at Lake Piker, then moved towards the River Darling, 280 kilometres away. Sometimes the scenery was quite magical, but perhaps it hid some of the bitterness that was brewing because of Burke's high-handed and often impatient manner. Then on to Menindee, which they reached on October the 15th. This was the last outpost of white settlement in New South Wales. Burke now faced a series of violent quarrels with his second-in-command, George Landels, a stubborn and difficult Englishman. This conflict between the 2 leaders split the whole party. Some liked Burke's style, others didn't. So Landels wrote this letter of resignation to Burke and headed back to Melbourne, prophesying doom for the expedition. Sir, upon mature consideration, I've arrived at the conclusion that my only course under recent and present circumstances is to tender the resignation of the appointment I now hold under you as second of the expedition under your orders. Dr. Herman Beckler, the medical officer, also resigned. Burke then appointed William Wright, a local station manager, as a guide. He was a good bushman who had travelled the country northwards as far as the Bulu River, but nobody knew much about his other qualities. Burke also appointed Wills as his new second-in-command. He was to be a loyal companion to Burke, and his exacting mind guided the expedition right across Australia and back again. With summer coming on, Burke became impatient and decided to divide his party at Menindee. His idea was that he would press on to Cooper's Creek to establish a depot and find water holes. Then he would send for the rest of the party and the stores. Burke left Menindee on October the 19th with Wills and 6 others, taking 16 camels and most of the horses. William Wright acted as their guide. Dr. Beckler agreed to stay with the expedition until he could be replaced. Burke and his advance party hurried north along the edge of the low ranges near Mutwinji. Towards the end of October, the country was starting to dry up. William John Wills kept a series of field books, noting down all the factual details of the expedition. Most of what we know today has come from his entries in these volumes. In these field books, the travelling entries start at the bottom of the page, giving times, features of rocks or creeks, the compass bearings of creeks or hills, and notes on barometer readings and temperatures. Another entry shows the time they made camp and the mark blazed on the tree. This was Camp 41 on Nantharangi Creek. This is Nantharangi Creek in the early morning. The waterhole here is known as Burke's Waterhole, but the blazed tree has long since gone. Burke and his advance party pushed on quickly into the sandy country across the Queensland border, and then onto the floodplains of the Cooper. William Wright, their guide, had returned to Menindee to bring up the rest of the party, for Burke had appointed him leader of the Menindee depot, due to Dr. Beckler's resignation. Finally, Burke set up a depot on Cooper's Creek at the Bulu Bulu Waterhole, near the present-day cattle station of Napa Merry. They reached this place on November the 20th, just 1 month after leaving Menindee. This is the place at Bulu Bulu Waterhole where they set up their depot. Their camp was just to the right of the picture, under the shadow of some large coolabahs. The old coolabah trees are still there, or at least some of them are. The expedition now had 2 depots, Burke at Cooper's Creek with 7 men and most of the camels and horses, and Dr. Beckler and Wright at Menindee with most of the stores and only 9 camels and 7 horses. They waited Burke's orders. Meanwhile, the rivalry with South Australian explorer John McDouall Stuart was revived. In April, Stuart had planted a flag at the centre of the continent before being forced back to Adelaide by some very difficult country. But now, in November 1860, he was starting out again, and the Royal Society in Melbourne sent an urgent letter to Burke telling him of Stuart's plan for a new expedition. The only way they could get a message to Burke was to send it by a fast-riding police trooper. From Bendigo to Swan Hill, and from Swan Hill to Menindee. On November the 9th, Trooper Lyons from Swan Hill rode into the Darling depot with urgent messages for Burke, and on the same day, Wright got back to the depot after guiding Burke as far as Torrawatto Swamp, 250 kilometres away. The next day, Trooper Lyons raced off after Burke, taking 4 of the expedition's remaining horses and a saddler called Macpherson. Lyons also took an Aborigine called Dick to guide them. It was a futile task, for by now Burke was almost at Cooper's Creek, and summer was coming on. Ludwig Becker sketched this map of the police trooper's journey. Lyons followed Burke's tracks between the 2 Sugarloaf Hills, but his horses died in the heat. The crosses show where they perished. The 3 men were forced to give up and retreated to a waterhole where they were cared for by Aborigines in the area. The Aboriginal guide, Dick, then made a heroic journey back to the Menindee depot on foot and told Dr. Beckler and Wright what had happened. Dr. Beckler immediately set out for the waterhole, riding camels this time, to rescue the unfortunate trooper. The whole episode, from the time of Trooper Lyons' arrival in the depot to the date of his rescue, was almost 2 months. Valuable time had been lost, and Wright had not yet heard from Burke. On the same day that Dick had staggered back into the Menindee depot alone, Burke was dividing his party again at Cooper's Creek. Here, at Depot 65, he was making his final plans for a dash to the Gulf before the wet season monsoon struck, for rain would make the journey almost impossible. He would take 3 men with him to the Gulf, leaving 4 behind at the depot. William Brahe was put in charge of Depot 65. He was a young German-born migrant who had joined the expedition in Melbourne. His instructions were to stay at the depot for 3 months and wait for Burke's return from Carpentaria. Nearby was the huge waterhole where they would fish, as the Aborigines did. In many ways, it was an ideal depot camp. Around Christmas Day, 1860, the advance party of Burke, Wills, King and Gray were crossing the stony desert that had defeated Charles Sturt 15 years earlier. The party of 4 men with their camels and Burke's horse Billy travelled about 30 kilometres a day, often going at night to avoid the high temperatures of the summer. Not all the desert was soft sand. Parts of it were covered with small wind-blown stones, called gibbers, that made it hard work for both camels and men. Meanwhile, back at Menindee, Wright's party had been forced to send to Melbourne for more money to buy extra pack horses, to replace those lost by lions or taken by Burke to Cooper's Creek. Although Dr. Beckler and Wright had been left with most of the stores, they hadn't been able to follow Burke because of the delay caused by Trooper Lyon's futile mission and the fact that they didn't have enough horses or camels to carry the huge quantity of stores. However, on January the 26th, with extra horses, the Menindee party started to move north towards Cooper's Creek. They passed the rugged hills around Mutwinji, a gathering place for Aboriginal tribes in the district. On February the 15th, they arrived at Torrawatto Swamp on Yankanya Creek. A small group of 17 Aborigines met the explorers, and Ludwig Becker sketched them watching the camels arrive. At about the same time, Burke, Wills, King and Gray arrived on the floodplains of the Flinders River, just 30 miles from the sea. The swamps and creeks here made it very difficult to actually get to the sea. So Burke and Wills set off by themselves, leaving the others to hold the 6 camels at Camp 119 for 4 or 5 days while they made a dash for the sea. Taking his horse Billy, Burke and Wills floundered through the mangroves and swamps for several miles until they reached a point where the river became tidal and they could actually taste the salt water. Burke wrote in his notebook, "It would have been well to say that we reached the sea, but we could not obtain a view of the open ocean, although we made every endeavor." The expedition was now spread out right across the continent. Burke and Wills were at the Gulf and about to return. Brahe was at Depot 65 on Cooper's Creek, and Wright and Beckler were not far from Menindee. Wright's party was now beginning to suffer seriously in the heat. By March, they were camped in these dried-up mud plains of the Bulu River. A dreary, desolate landscape of unbearable heat, flies, and rats which attacked the stores. Slowly, Wright's party moved on, many of them now suffering from scurvy and malnutrition. They reached the waterholes of the Bulu River, moving slowly from one to another. They arrived at Bulu Lake early in April. It's called Culiato on our maps today. They camped near this fine stretch of water, nearly 10 kilometers long and lined with trees. It offered a peaceful refuge for the sick and weary travelers. Wright made a few attempts to go onto Cooper's Creek himself, but apart from the hostile Aborigines, he wasn't exactly sure which way to go. He was not a surveyor and had no instruments or maps to help him find the way. Meanwhile, Burke and Wills were following their own tracks southwards, back to the depot at Cooper's Creek. 3 months had already gone by since they left the depot in mid-December, and all of them were getting weak from the hardships and poor food. Burke's horse and 4 of the camels had already died. 120 kilometers from Cooper's Creek, one of the 4 men, Charlie Gray, died. They spent a whole day digging a shallow grave at the edge of a dried-up lake amongst the sand dunes, not far from where this picture was taken. The 3 men now pushed on. They were just 4 days away from the depot at Cooper's Creek, where they hoped that food, clothes, and rest would revive them. It was April the 18th. On the same day, at the depot, Brahe was making plans to leave. He stayed 1 month longer than ordered to by Burke, and anyway, food was getting low, and 1 man was injured and dying from scurvy. Brahe buried some provisions here, hoping that the Aborigines wouldn't find them. He carved the word "dig" onto a tree and left a note buried with the stores. This is the note he left behind. Notice the date. Depot, Cooper's Creek, April 21st, 1861. The depot party of VEE leaves this camp today to return to the Darling. I intend to go southeast from Camp 60 to get to our old track near Pulu. 2 of my companions and myself are quite well. The 3rd, Patton, has been unable to walk for the last 18 days as his leg has been severely hurt when thrown by one of the horses. No person has been up here from the Darling. We have 6 camels and 12 horses in good working condition. William Brahe. At 7 o'clock in the evening of the very same day, Burke, Wills and King staggered into the Cooper's Creek depot. In the moonlight, they read the word "dig" cut into the bark of a tree. The astonished explorers found Brahe's note buried with the flour and rice. It was a tragic twist of fate that they had missed Brahe by just 7 hours. This old coolabah is the famous dig tree where the drama took place, where Brahe had waited so long ago. After reading Brahe's note, Burke made another strange decision. Instead of following Brahe to Menindee, he reckoned it would be quicker to head off in the opposite direction towards the settled districts north of Adelaide. On the same day that Burke, Wills and King returned to the depot, April the 21st, the relief party, under Wright and Dr. Beckler, was still camped at Bulu Lake, 250 kilometers away. 3 of the men were dying of scurvy, including the artist Ludwig Becker. Bulu Lake is one of the largest waterholes along the southern part of the Bulu River, and was obviously a gathering place for Aborigines in the area. They resented the intrusion of Wright's party and continually attacked the small band of whites. Brahe, on his way south from Cooper's Creek, met Wright and Dr. Beckler here. Wright's depot at Bulloo Lake can still be located by the blaze on an old tree near the water. And nearby are some posts that are supposed to mark the graves of Ludwig Becker, Charles Stone, and William Purcell, all dying here during the last week of April 1861, the same week that Burke arrived back at his depot on Cooper's Creek. The two groups were only about 250 kilometers apart, Burke at Cooper's Creek and the others at Bulloo Lake. Both groups were exhausted and sick. The Bulloo Lake party were now not sure that Burke was ever going to return to Cooper's Creek, and anyway, Wright thought it better to try to get back to Menindee before any more of his people died. Before they left Bulloo, Brahe and Wright decided to have one more look at the Cooper's Creek depot, just in case Burke had returned. They saddled up some horses and rode over these mud plains to Depot 65. When they reached the old depot on May the 8th, they failed to notice that anyone had dug up the buried stores. There were a few clues, but they weren't observant enough to notice them. If they had dug up the box of food, they would, of course, have found Burke's note. On the very same day, Burke, Wills and King were only 40 kilometers away, about 1 day's ride southwest of their depot. Burke and Wills, further down Cooper's Creek, had just lost the last of their camels and were again cutting up the meat for drying. Then they headed south towards the settled districts north of Adelaide, down Gregory's old track towards Mount Hopeless. But away from the Cooper, they could find no water, and so were forced to turn back. William John Wills made one more visit to the depot, where he left all his field books and this penciled note. May the 30th, 1861. We have been unable to leave the creek. Both camels are dead, and our provisions are done. Mr. Burke and King are down on the lower part of the creek. I am about to return to them, and we shall all probably come up this way. We're trying to live the best way we can, like the blacks, but find it hard work. Our clothes are going to pieces fast. Send provisions and clothes as soon as possible. William J. Wills. The depot party, having left contrary to instructions, has put us in this fix. After burying this note, Wills staggered back to his companions. Burke and King had meanwhile taken over some old Aboriginal gunyahs, keeping rations and ammunition in one and living in the other on fish and nardoo seed. Here King is seen supporting the failing Wills. The young surveyor asked Burke and King to leave him here. He just couldn't go any further. Wills was a loyal companion to the end. For although he thought Burke should have tried to follow Brahe back to Menindee, he stuck with Burke's decision to try to reach Adelaide. Wills died at this long waterhole on Cooper's Creek on about June the 30th, 1861. He had urged Burke and King to head back towards the old depot, and he died alone a few days after they had gone. Burke himself was also dying, with John King, the young man from the Indian Army, his only companion. Burke asked King to place a revolver in his hand, but the only enemy here was perhaps his own personality, his impatience, and a kind of blundering courage that caused his death from exhaustion and malnutrition. Burke died only about 30 meters from this huge waterhole in the land of the Yantrawantas, the tribe of Aborigines who lived along this part of Cooper's Creek. In Burke's last note, he put the blame on others. "I hope we shall be done justice to. We've fulfilled our task, but we were not followed up as I expected, and the depot party abandoned their post. King has behaved nobly, and I hope he will be properly cared for. Robert O'Hara Burke." A few days later, the Aborigines covered Burke's body with leaves and branches and took pity on the lonely survivor. John King managed to live with these friendly Aborigines for the next 2 months. In Melbourne, the Exploration Committee became anxious and asked Alfred Howard to form a relief party and go to Cooper's Creek immediately. Howard was a surveyor and a bushman who had worked in Gippsland. A few days after setting off, he met William Brahe returning to Melbourne with the news that Burke hadn't returned to Cooper's Creek. Howard's relief party and Brahe reached the banks of Cooper's Creek on September the 13th. Howard was an experienced bushman. He travelled light, and it was the best time of the year to find surface water for the horses. They found the depot much as Brahe had left it, and no sign that anyone had been there for many months. So they followed the camel tracks that led down the creek in a westerly direction. Not far away, John King was living with the Yantrawantas, sharing a shelter with some of the young men of the tribe and being fed and cared for by these people of Cooper's Creek. On September the 15th, the Aborigines became excited, telling King that white men were coming. Howard and his men found King weak and in tattered clothes. King told them what had happened to Burke, Wills and Gray, and how they reached the Gulf of Carpentaria 7 months ago. After a day or two regaining his strength, King took Howard to the places where Wills and Burke had died, both near large water holes on Cooper's Creek. Howard and his men buried Burke under the twisted coolabah where he'd died 2 months earlier. Howard's job was now complete. He'd solved the mystery of the disappearance of Burke, Wills, King and Gray and found the only survivor. Three more search parties had been out looking for Burke and Wills, one led by William Lansborough, another by Frederick Walker, and a third by John McKinley. These search parties opened up a tremendous area of land known previously only to the Aboriginal tribes who had lived peacefully there for thousands of years. In Melbourne, on January the 21st, 1863, the funeral of Burke and Wills took place. The people of Victoria had sent Howard back yet again to Cooper's Creek to bring home the bodies of the explorers for a hero's burial. It was a public holiday, and more than 40,000 people saw the procession down Collins Street. The disaster was being turned into a kind of triumph. Burke and Wills died in one of the most beautiful parts of Australia, near the largest waterhole on the continent. Most of their problems were caused by a series of bad decisions, dividing the expedition into 3 groups, losing communication, and most of all, carrying too many supplies. All these cost the lives of 7 people.